changes, the changes that are happening, the real-time changes that are happening. Indigenous peoples know when plants are disappearing, when birds are disappearing, when amphibians are disappearing from a certain area. For example, where I come from, in the Interlake of Manitoba, because of the constant flooding that we've endured throughout the decades, Indigenous people know, excuse me, know uh, species that are associated with the region. They know that the frogs that disappeared from the area. Indigenous peoples know that a healthy ecosystem is when you can hear the frogs. And for the area I come from, you don't. There's no more frogs anymore. And as well, too, they know what the trees look like when they're dying and what that means, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit more. So, Indigenous peoples base their knowledge on the experiential, the living on the land, and the natural laws, the natural environment, etc. Biodiversity is really important. When we talk about climate change, biodiversity is what we look at. Are we losing biodiversity? Indigenous peoples represent less than 10% of the global population, but they protect more than 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. And it's important to acknowledge that because within this as well too is the importance of language. Uh, it's really important to acknowledge the importance of language when it comes to Indigenous peoples and the protection of biodiversity. Because within the language we have the traditional naming of the spaces and places across Canada, for example, like especially the rivers, the lakes, certain lands, the landscapes that are based on the indigenous names. And these names are based on what Indigenous people knew was the role uh, and the function within the ecosystem. So knowing these Anishinaabe words is really important when we're trying to determine baseline monitoring and developing understanding of the indicators of change over time. We can go back to the original naming of the rivers by Indigenous peoples and understand what the changes are over time. We have the Anishinaabe laws. Anishinaabe laws I talk about because I'm Anishinaabe. There's Cree laws as well, which are similar, but I'm going to be talking from the Anishinaabe perspective. We have the natural laws, which refer to the natural, which an, the natural order of creation, and this refers to uh, the way a queue was created, the natural flow of the currents, for example, within the rivers. And again, these are all related, the language law and the natural law, and the laws within the earth, the purpose of the waters, lakes, the air, flora, they all have a purpose, and we have to respect that. We have to understand what the purpose is. And within these laws, there's a patterns, trajectories, which reflects the way we understand nature, the universe. We have that responsibility to observe what the natural laws are. And again, the language language is really important, traditional laws, because within the Anishinaabe ways we have the language and traditional laws that guide our behavior in the way we treat the land and our relations, everything around us. We have teachings, for example, uh, the word the word in Jine in Anishinaabemowin means um, there's a certain way we have to treat uh, trees, for example, the way we treat water, the way we treat the animals and the birds around us, and we're guided by those teachings. We have the language law, which describes the natural law, and these are very important because, like I said, words within the Anishinaabe describes the role, the function that was given within the ecosystem, like the landscape. Like for example, Saskatchewan means in Anishinaabe, Saskatchewan, which means where the water disappears, dissolves. And if you think about the watershed that's coming from the Rockies, why is that like in that specific area? When you go into Saskatchewan, for example, when you look at the landscape, it's mostly flat. There's no water. So indigenous peoples, they understood that the landscape, but they understood the role of water, and that they understood what happened to the water within the landscape that they lived in. And another name in Manitoba as well, we have a Dauphin River, which means Saskatchewanung, and that's what it's called in Anishinaabe. And again, what that means is where the water empties into the lake, drains into the lake. And the word Sagaigan, which means lake in Anishinaabe, again, what that means is where the water flows into an area. That's what that means. So it's really important to start to understand, uh, learn about certain indigenous words. That way you can understand the naming and the purpose behind some of these names. And the creation law as well too. This refers to the bigger, like the universe, where there's balance, harmony, and these are important as well. Because growing up as well too, a lot of the stories that were passed was from the elders that I knew that were in my area, and they shared a lot of stories with me. Like for example, they share stories that the stars that we see now, they used to be brighter. Uh, maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they used to be brighter. They say now the stars that we see, they're not as bright anymore. And as well too, like they have a knowledge of the colors within the seasons of what the nighttime looks like. Like for example, in the fall, they know that the nighttime is usually so dark. There's hardly any light, and these are all part of the observations. And the observations that I grew up with regarding the teachings. For example, the color of the sky. This morning, I was discussing when I was looking out of the window here at the University of Calgary, where I'm at. As I was watching the sunrise, it was all rosy, kind of red looking, kind of an orange looking. And the teaching that my mom and the elders around me and describe that is there's going to be more warm days. It's not going to be cool yet. And the way the sun sets as well is the indigenous peoples, the bears. their travels, what they used to do based on the color of the sunset. That way they can predict what they wanted to do for the next day, for the next weeks. And a lot of the words within Anishinaabe, we use a lot of verbs that are based on action. Like for example, when we talk about birthdays, we essentially talk about the number of winters you are here. When I ask someone, when I ask someone what their age is, I ask them in the Thipipunin, which means how many winters are you? So the words that we use reflect the land that we're on. The traditional teachings are really important too, because within the traditional teachings, we have the ethics, we have the responsibility, values, and these are based on the relationships that we have with one another. We have words as well that describe the way we have to treat we have to treat each other. If we mistreat something, we're going to have we have the word patawa, means which, which means that someone is going to suffer for what you just did. Excuse me. And I described language laws. The language laws are really important because they determine climate change. And we talk about climate change, what's happening around us. And for example, the one I talked about regarding the frogs, that's an indicator of climate change. When you hear the frogs, that means the ecosystem is healthy. And some of these are descriptors when when a species start disappearing from a region. That means that something is wrong. There's certain birds too that are disappearing because what's happening too with climate change, the habitat is being destroyed. When there's floods, the species that live there and that we coexist with cannot live there anymore. We may live there, but they can't live there, so they uh, they don't they find new places, or else they become their numbers become low, extinct. And the language law is really important. Like I said, in describing with the language law, we can determine baseline monitoring based on language, and the indicators of change. Um, uh, with um, with climate change, it's really important to understand the role when we can use indigenous science and Western science, because it's really important to talk to the elders, knowledge keepers of the land. We can use Western science to track water levels, for example, but we need that indigenous science where the indigenous peoples, the oral history, the oral tradition of indigenous peoples, they know what the land was like, where science is about the numbers, the graphing, and that's where they determine um, management. If land is too dry or land is too wet, that the water levels are low, high, etc. But indigenous peoples, because of the mental tracking, they know what the landscape is like. For indigenous peoples, the natural laws that they know when floods occur. Indigenous peoples know that flooding occurs naturally, about 50 years or so, and the flooding occurs for the land to regenerate. For my region, I'll give my region as an example. Flooding occurred naturally, so the people moved away for the season